we'll try to get you answered just as quickly as possible. So again, this is just designed to sort of pique your curiosity and to invite you to look at food and scripture in very intentional ways. So yeah, we will be, as I said, recording this. Feel free if you feel like you want to stay muted during most of this, you're welcome to. And again, if you have a question, please raise your hand, wave it, yell, unmute, whatever.
Or just unmute and holler. That might be the easiest way to do it.
Right. And again, as Joanna's already said, feel free to cook along with us or just watch. And you should already have access to all the recipes that we sent those out. So, and that is courtesy of Pastor Joanne. She has put this big thing together. This is really her thing today. So I'm just excited to sort of be the sous chef, so to speak, and to go along with this. So, and feel free as well during our time today, to grab a beverage. It might be a glass of wine. It might be a stein of beer. And you'll find out that both wine and beer were not unknown in the ancient biblical world. So we'll have an opportunity to toast in just a bit with that. So also just a reminder that this time together, we invite you to consider, if you would care to, not necessary, but consider perhaps making a donation to one of two places. If you're from Emmanuel, you are invited anytime following today in honor of the day to make a donation to ELCA World Hunger. Again, a very worthy outreach of our denomination. ELCA World Hunger benefits not only localities with food pantries and soup kitchens, but they benefit community organizing and advocacy efforts as well. And last year alone, they gave over $23 million to help combat systemic hunger and poverty, not only nationally, but internationally as well. So if you're from Emmanuel, please feel free to make a donation to ELCA World Hunger. If you're from Incarnate Word today, we are certainly inviting members of Incarnate Word to make a monetary donation, if you'd care to the Community Food Cupboard located on Nestor Street in the city. They do a lot of food outreach specifically to senior citizens who are homebound, who are on limited income, and as well they have food available on emergency basis for families as well. So we've been supporting that organization at Incarnate Word for many years. In fact, I think Carol, you can probably speak to it. I know John has done so much volunteer work with the Community Food Cupboard. But so again, we do invite you today to, if you're from Incarnate Word, to make a donation to the Community Food Cupboard if you'd like to do that. Without any further ado, I think we should probably just jump right into things here.
Okay. All right. People have asked me over the years, where did I get this idea of doing this? And, this has just become kind of a hobby for me. Whoops, we're actually aiming at our computer with our mouse from far away. So, okay. So I can't find the X. There it is. Okay. So anyway, the whole idea of this came up with a trip to the Holy Land. The first time I went to the Holy Land, everybody said to me, oh, you'll never read the Bible the same way again. You are just going to absolutely love it. And you go to the Holy Land to walk in the footsteps of Jesus, to see all those ancient things. And I was ready for that, and I was excited. What you never hear about is that people go to the Holy Land for the food. I loved the food. It was incredible. And I fell in love with these spices and the tastes and all of these kinds of things. And it kind of just began this interest for me. And well, okay, let's learn Middle Eastern cooking. But then it kind of morphed into, well, what would people during Jesus' day have eaten? What would things have done? And how did that affect different stories in the Bible? So that's kind of where this all came from. So just to share with you, when we talk about, oops, there we go. when we talk about the Holy Land and everything, there's some wonderful things that we can learn. So we're going to talk about geography, we're going to talk about agriculture, we're going to talk about spices, we're going to talk about all kinds of things. So at this point, though, let's begin with a word of prayer.
I invite you to join us in speaking the Jewish table prayer. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe. You nourish us, the whole world,
with goodness, grace, kindness, and mercy.
Blessed
Blessed are you, Lord,
for you
for
nourish
you
the
nourish
whole
the whole
universe.
When we talk about the whole idea of Middle Eastern cooking, and even just cooking in the Holy Land, geography really matters, because cooking in the north of Israel and cooking in the south down in Sinai are very different. And when we talk about the lands of the Bible, we're also extending to Egypt and around the Aegean as we talk about Paul's life. Even just talking about all these things in Israel itself, it's really different. This is a picture from Sinai. And this is what the desert areas of the Holy Land look like. And as you can see, not much grows there. So in these areas, this would be in the south, maybe Egypt, maybe, this just around the Dead Sea in that area. What you would see would be more grain and things like that. The primary beverage there would actually be beer. Beer was brewed in the south of Israel as far back as anybody can imagine. But it's more grains and things like that. There was some herding, but you wouldn't have all the fresh vegetables and things like that. This is, I apologize, I didn't write down where I got this picture, but this is around the Aegean. And these are remains from what Paul would have known. And if you think about the area around the Aegean Sea, around the Mediterranean, where Paul was doing his ministry, we're talking Corinth, we're talking Ephesus, we're talking, all of these kinds of places, but these were much more cosmopolitan. And so they wouldn't necessarily be Jewish folks in the majority. So here, everything goes. And you had things, because they were a lot of seaport towns, things from all around the Aegean, all around the Mediterranean. Things would have been brought in from the Far East, things from Africa, from Morocco, from Egypt, and things like that. So the cuisine here was very, very, very diverse and definitely not kosher. Jerusalem, of course, would have been kosher. This was a Jewish city, but they still would have had access to some things from around around the known world of that time. Maybe not as much with the fresh vegetables and things like that, but meats would have been available. Much fish and olives and olive oil would have been shipped down from in Galilee, but even a little bit more of a limited palate, that kind of thing. But today we're going to focus on Galilee. Galilee is considered the agricultural center of the Holy Land. If you look at the map, I can get my cursor going here. There we go. Here's around the Sea of Galilee. This is where Jesus primarily did his ministry. Capernaum, up here at the north of the Sea of Galilee, was thought of as Jesus' hometown. His disciples would have been fishermen from around this area. If you look over here, we've got Cana, where we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but that was all about wine production. Nazareth is down here. But this was all agricultural land, so lots of fruits, lots of vegetables, and fish, but we'll talk about that a little bit later too. So we're going to basically focus on the cuisine of Galilee. Of course, the Sea of Galilee is a freshwater sea. It's an inland sea, and fishing was the primary business. If you want to know what kind of fish they had, what we think of, it's called St. Peter's fish, but it's as close to tilapia as you can get. So if you really want to eat first century and do some fish, grab some tilapia and roast it or put it on the grill or something like that, and that gets you as close to that as you can. But believe it or not, fish even though fishing was the primary occupation, not everybody had access to fish whenever they wanted. There were syndicates, and there were these huge groups that would hire these fishermen, and most of the fish that was caught was put into oil, was salted, and shipped off down to Jerusalem and to other places around the Holy Land. And you were very limited with what you could keep yourself. So the primary diet in Galilee was actually a vegetarian diet. It didn't mean they didn't eat fish or meat, but it was just very, very rare to eat those things. And when they would have eaten meat, it would have been on special occasions. It would have been on maybe Jewish holidays like Passover, where lamb is one of the main dishes, or on wedding feasts, or when you kill the fatted calf because your long lost son comes home. But those were actually rare occasions. In Galilee, wine production was a big thing. Vineyards were really common. And interestingly, today, Galilee isn't known for its wines, but it's kind of an up-and-coming wine area. But back during Jesus' day, they would have known about wine. The idea of vineyards and wine and those kinds of things, vines, are mentioned hundreds of times throughout the Bible. And usually they're often mentioned in two different ways, either as a warning not to imbibe too much that you get drunk, but also it's seen as abundance. Wine was a gift from God. These are amphora. This is basically how wine was stored back in Jesus' day. And so here we see, that talk about wine, but wine was only one of the things that talked about abundance. This is from Deuteronomy and talks about how God blesses us in so many different ways. And if you notice, he says he will bless the fruit of your womb, the fruit of your ground, your grain, your wine, and your oil, the increase of your cattle, and the issue of your flock in the land that he swore to your ancestors to give you. So most of the time when we see wine and oil and grain and vineyards and all these things, it's talking about God's abundance. This is one of my favorite passages because Timothy is actually writing to bishops on how to be a good bishop. Well, back during Timothy's day, bishops were thought of as pastors. So I love this. It says that if you're going to be a pastor, you need to drink wine. So no longer drink only water, but take a little wine for the sake of your stomach and your frequent ailments. Like I said, in Galilee, the main, there we go. I'm just far enough away that this is kind of crazy. The main beverage would have been wine. It wasn't just something people liked. It wasn't just a choice. It was the main beverage. And because water was not always very pure, wine was the preferred beverage. And we're told that in those days, people would mix wine with water. And people, and many historians for a long time thought, well, it's probably just to cut the wine or to make it go further or so you don't get drunk. But now some historians are looking at this and saying it was probably the other way around. Wine was actually probably added to the water because the alcohol in the wine served to purify the water. So if you want to really drink like a first century person, mix your wine with about half and half water and then add some honey to it. But trust me, it's disgusting. So, like I said, in the South, it would have been beer. North would have been wine, but anything else goes. So at this point, we invite you, if you don't already have a beverage, go ahead and grab something to drink because I'm going to turn this over to Doug.
Well, we're going to take a little toast here, but let me just share a tiny, very brief history of toasting. I'm talking like 10 seconds. So as far as we know, many cultures have done this toasting thing. I'm lifting up especially the Greek and Roman cultures. Right around the 6th century BC, there's evidence of toasting in Greek culture, where oftentimes you would toast to the Greek gods, and you would toast to the gods' health, you would toast to your own well-being in relationship to the gods. Well, later on in antiquity, the Romans picked up on this Greek tradition of toasting the gods, but you might recall that the first Roman emperor, Augustus, was himself thought to be Son of God. That's how he referred to himself. Everybody referred to him as Son of God, born half from I guess he had a human mother and a Greek god and a Roman god. So he was thought to be divine, thought to be a god. So long about his Caesar Augustus's reign, the Roman Senate decided that they really wanted to kiss up to Caesar. So they decreed that every meal that you take at home or wherever it is, you had to toast Caesar Augustus. That's just how it had to be. So you would raise your glass, a toast to Caesar. But what's interesting about raising your glass, let me just quickly go back just to the Greeks real fast, back in 6th century BC. It was one of the preferred methods of killing somebody that you didn't like was to poison them. So when the Greeks would toast, the host would hold up the glass and take a sip from that to show everybody in attendance that there was no poison in that glass. So that's where you raise the glass to show that this is not poisonous. Much like when you extend your hand to shake somebody's hand, you're showing that you don't have a weapon up your sleeve. You're safe to shake my hand. Well, you would raise your glass not only to honor the gods, but to show your guests that you're not trying to poison them. And again, this was also followed in the Roman times as well. So there's been a history of toasting the gods and toasting the godlike people. Even the earliest Christians, when they would have little feasts in some of the catacombs, they would actually raise a toast to the saints. So to raise a toast is very much in keeping with our tradition. And I'm going to offer just a very brief Roman toast for us. And so I invite you to raise your glass. Bibe multis annis. Drink that you may live for many years. Okay, well, that was my 10 seconds.
It was longer than 10 seconds. Let's get to cooking. There we go. This was an early wine cellar. I forgot to show these earlier. It was just excavated in 2014, and it had over 40 bottles of wine in it, where they actually were able to go in and kind of test the wine. They said it was actually very fine wine. And this is a wine cellar in Bethsaida, which was a Jewish community. So it shows that wine was very much kind of one of the things. I'm going to turn this over to Doug while I get some things ready. He's going to share with you a little bit about the wedding at Cana. And I'm going to get some things ready, and we'll be back in about 2 minutes.
So many of you are, I'm sure, are all familiar with the story of the wedding at Cana. And this, of course, in John's gospel is the very first miracle that Jesus performs. And so, of course, this is always a text that is used in our own wedding ceremonies, even though the wedding ceremonies back in Jesus' day were not exactly like the wedding ceremonies now. In fact, oftentimes in Jesus' day, a wedding ceremony, a wedding celebration would easily go for a week at a time. It was just one huge celebration for a week. But here's the thing, if you wanted the celebration to continue, you had to have wine. If the wine ran out, yeah, we might say in our own time, well, that's just bad planning. Somebody didn't plan for enough guests. But back in Jesus' day, if the wine runs out, that was seen as somehow you've lost God's blessing, that God's blessing is made manifest at this wedding in the wine. Now, oftentimes at these week-long celebrations, the hosts were no dummies. they knew that they would serve their finest wines at the start of the week. And by the time you got to the end of the week, it was really okay to serve gut wine because at that point people weren't concerned anymore. They had been drinking all week long. So often it was customary to serve the really watered down rock gut wine at the end of the week. Well, in this gospel story, of course, Jesus and his mother are at a wedding in Cana, and of course, the wine runs out early. And so Jesus' mother is panicking because we know that if the wine runs out, the blessing goes away, or so it was believed. And so mom comes to her son and says, "What are you going to do about this, Jesus? The wine's run out." And we know from this story that Jesus takes 6 water jugs, each containing, what was it, 30 gallons of water for the rites of purification. And he takes those 30-gallon jugs and changes that into wine, but not just rock gut wine, the finest of wines, which is a wonderful way of reminding us that Jesus represents the finest gift of God, that Jesus represents God's abundance. And so I think this is significant. That, of course, in and of itself is significant, but the fact that Scripture uses food to illustrate the reality of God's abundance says that food is actually pretty important to us. And of course, back in this day, it's an agrarian culture. You're living closer to the land than perhaps we do today. So food was so critical to folks. So it makes sense then that the biblical witnesses would talk about God's abundance in terms of food and in terms of wine.
Okay. So we're going to make some bread, actually. In the ancient world, in the Holy Land, there was food historians talk about what's called the Mediterranean Triad. It is grain, oil, and wine. We just talked about wine. We're going to talk about grain now. Wheat was grown, but wheat was actually pretty much reserved for the wealthier folks. The poorer folks would have used barley. And barley, what's fascinating is if you've ever kind of read about genetic modification of grains and things, wheat today looks very different than what wheat did back in the ancient world. And right now there is a kind of a push to kind of regain what those first century grains would have been like. Interestingly, barley has not changed. I tried to find I found a barley recipe, but I couldn't find barley flour, unfortunately, until yesterday. So stay tuned for the barley recipe. But today we're going to make wheat bread. This is an ancient from about the 1st century, actually from the town of Capernaum. This is a mill. And if you look at that, the grain would have been put into the big, and this is huge, that these things are probably about 4 to 5 feet in diameter. The grain would have put in there. The millstone is that round part. And a pole would have been put through there. And either men would have just kind of taken it and just walked around with it to crush the grain, or else you would have had oxen or a donkey or something like that would do that. This was another style of mill where you would put the grain in the top, and again, you see that little square on the side, wooden poles would have put in there, and it would have been turned around to mill the grain. What we're going to make today is shepherd's bread. This is one of the easiest bread recipes you can possibly make, and I am not a great bread baker, but this, knock on wood, has never failed me. It's a really easy, very basic bread recipe. You can just use a packet of yeast, rapid rise, or the regular stuff. I tend to use this kind, which is just in the bottle, either 2 1/4 teaspoons or 1 packet. About a tablespoon of honey. I don't usually measure it. I just squirt it right in. And 1 to 1 1/4 cups of water. I've always used 1 1/4 cups, and that's always tended to work for me. And when you think about what the essentially what the temperature should be, if you ever gave a baby a bath and you put your elbow in the water and it feels warm but doesn't burn, that's perfect for this bread recipe. But like I said, this is a very, very, very forgiving recipe. And so if it's a little cooler or a little warmer, I think it'll still work. I tend to use bread flour. It has a little bit higher gluten in it, and it allows things to rise a little more. I haven't tried this, but someone else has told me that they've used this recipe and they've used half white flour and half whole wheat flour, and it worked just fine. Bread measuring is not an exact science. It's all about the consistency. What I have found is that for me, the 1¼ cups of water and 3 cups of flour tends to be the magic number for me. So, but what you do is you take your, I talked about that. You'll take your yeast and your honey and just dissolve those things together in the water. Make sure it's all dissolved. And then we're going to add the flour 1 cup at a time. And then you just mix it up as you go along. Let it get a little bit, mix it in. Like I said, 1 cup at a time. Eventually it's going to get really, really thick, and then you get to get your hands dirty and you get to stick your hands in and knead it that way. So just 1 cup at a time. And it really does work great. Like I said, grain was a prime crop in the first century, and it took probably about 30 hours, I read someplace, to mill enough grain for a family of 5 or 6. So when we talk about food production was incredibly time consuming. I remember when we used to go camping, one of the things that I always complained about with camping was that I would get up in the morning and spend 2 hours making breakfast. Then we would clean up the breakfast dishes, and then it was time to make lunch. We would clean up the lunch dishes, and then we had to make dinner. That's why I don't like camping, because I never got to do anything else. The kids all got to do fun things. I had to keep cooking all day long. But that was very much what it was like in the first century. It was the idea that if you were a woman or if you were a young child, your primary job was basically providing meals, because it really took that long. What I usually do is I usually mix everything in the bowl until it is just nice and firm. And then I just dump it onto my breadboard. Then you get to knead. And this is where you can take out all your frustrations. I love to knead bread. And for me, I never make bread that you don't knead. You always see these recipes every now and then. They say, oh, this is a no knead loaf of bread. It's the kneading that's the fun part for me. So while I'm kneading, Doug's going to share with you some more things. You do this PowerPoint because I can't.
Oh.
Okay.
I think you were going to talk about the Exodus.
Oh, that's right.
Wait, where's the share here?
The
Sorry.
green down at the bottom. Yeah, my job was the sharing screen stuff. I was supposed to do the computer, but I forgot that my hands were going to be dirty.
Here we go. Okay, we'll get here. And there. Here we go. All right. Do you want to talk about the Exodus?
Sure, I'll talk about the Exodus.
Sure.
I think, when we think about bread, of course, we think about the meal of Holy Communion and the Last Supper, which was probably a Passover celebration. And we see this as this comes from the Exodus, where God is giving the instructions to Moses to share with all the people. This is on the night of the final plague, when all the firstborn of Israel will be struck dead. And God says, but no, if you put the blood of a lamb on your doorpost, I will pass over you. And the instructions were that you were to make unleavened bread. And the reason for that probably is because there's not going to be time to let the bread rise. And because in those days, it was more like using a sourdough starter. People would have their bread cultures, or they would use wine or some kind of juice, because if you think about grapes, that white substance on the outside of grapes is actually yeast. And so that was what basically was used to make the bread rise. And so at the time of the Exodus, God's instructions were, be ready to go, because finally Pharaoh is going to let you go. So it was a whole thing about eating unleavened bread. Once the Israelites left Egypt, they found themselves having crossed the Red Sea. They found themselves out in the middle of the wilderness, and they're going, yay, we're away from Pharaoh. We're not slaves anymore. But then they looked around. And remember that picture I showed you of the very dry desert? That's where they were. And so the question was, where are we going to find water? Where are we going to find food? How are we going to survive this? And so they turned against Moses and said, you've brought us out here to die. What are we going to do? And so Moses went to God and said, God's going to provide. God promised that that God would send manna and that God would send quails. And so then we get the whole idea of manna in the wilderness. And we always think of manna. We usually translate manna as being bread. It's great. The Hebrew word for manna literally means, what is it? Because this stuff just kind of showed up on the ground. And they said it was kind of like coriander seed, white, and the taste was like wafers made with honey. And so that was the whole question was, what is it? Now you can go.
Okay. Well, so playing on this whole idea of manna, where God provides in the wilderness, we now fast forward a few years to Jesus' life, and specifically to John's telling of Jesus' life. And here in John's gospel, we have Jesus with God's people out in the wilderness, and we find out that just prior to what you see on your screen here, Jesus sees a crowd coming, and he goes up onto a mountain. He goes up onto a hillside. Well, we know that in Scripture, whenever God does anything great, whenever God does anything life-saving, God always does it on top of a mountain. And so Jesus goes up a hill when he sees the crowds coming. So automatically we know, wait, God's going to do something huge here. And so, again, that's even referencing way back to Isaiah chapter 25, when Isaiah says, on this mountaintop, the Lord will provide a rich feast of rich foods, of well-aged wines. And so I think that in this gospel story of Jesus going up on a hillside, getting ready to feed people, that is a reminder to us that Jesus is providing manna for God's people in the wilderness. And what's interesting about this story is that we're told that there are 5,000 people coming to eat. And of course, Jesus' disciples, they see this, and all they can think of is what they don't have. All they can think of is that we don't have enough food to feed all these people. It's going to take 6 months worth of wages to provide enough food for everybody. So just think of what your own annual salaries are or used to be, and that's a lot of money for feeding folks. So his disciples are really scared. How are we going to feed these folks? And then Jesus looks, and there's this boy coming up, and he has 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Now, what's interesting, Jesus says, that alone, that will feed everybody. That's enough. His disciples can't imagine that's going to be enough. But what's really cool about this story is the boy who brings the bread, we find out that the bread is made from barley. And as Pastor Joanne just pointed out a bit ago, barley was the cheapest ingredient for making bread, much cheaper, much more affordable than wheat would have been. And so barley was really used primarily by the indentured, by the peasant folks, by those who could barely put food on their own table. So it's interesting, Jesus takes this bread that's made from barley. And not only is he able to feed 5,000 people with just this little bit of bread and some fish, but we're told at the end that there was food left over, which again spells that reality to us of God working in abundance. And I just find it so encouraging that Jesus uses food to illustrate God's abundance. So food is really so much more than just food. I think it's really a sign of the coming kingdom of God where there is plenty for everybody in abundance. So.
Okay. You want to turn the thing off?
Sure, yeah.
Thank you. That one's just to tantalize you for later. Once your bread is at a point where it's like elastic, once you can pull the dough and it bounces back, it's ready. It should be smooth, it should feel really good and everything like that. Like I said, this is very easy. Break it in half, break that in half, and just keep dividing it into about 8 pieces. And there are a couple of different ways you can do this. This is such an easy bread recipe. You can either do it as flatbread, and you can just do it on the grill, literally on your grill in the backyard. You can do it in a frying pan, just put a tiny dab of olive oil, or the way we love to do it, which we can't do it now because you have to do this over an open fire or an open flame, is to make sage. I think in the recipes I sent out, I shared the whole sage thing, which is what is made in the north of Israel, in Lebanon and Syria. And these women still make it the same way. This is a sage pan. It looks a lot like a wok, and you'd think you'd use it this way, but you use it upside down. And people say you can use, I don't know if you can see that there, that you can actually use an upside down wok for this as well. And I just got soot all over my hands. But you take this, and sage is actually Arabic for cloth. And so what you can do is you roll out your bread, your dough, as thin as you can, and you can roll it out with a rolling pin, and you then drape it over the top of the sage. It takes about 30 seconds. You flip it, and you get this wonderful, soft, just incredible flatbread. But we're going to do more loaves today because when we come back, when we're not in COVID anymore, we'll have a sage party and actually do it over an open fire sometime. All this is very simple. Take it, and just with your fingers, it doesn't even have to be perfect. If you're obsessive, you can make it in perfect circles. I make it in blobs, and I think the blobs work really well. And then put it on either a lightly oiled baking pan, or you can put it on I use parchment because I don't like oiling things. So I just put it on parchment, and it works really great. And I just pull it out like this and keep it nice and thin. And just keep doing that until you have 6 or 8 pieces, depending how big you want your pieces of bread. You do that. I'm not going to finish this right now because it'll take me a while. You take just a kitchen cloth, a towel. You can even do it with paper towels. Wet it with warm water and just lay it over top of the bread and let it rise. This is the miracle of this bread. You can let it rise for 15 minutes and it'll be really good. If you want it amazing, let it rise for an hour. But anything in between works. Those of you from Emmanuel, if you remember 3 years ago, this summer, I baked bread for the sermon. This is the recipe I used, and I was able to make it from scratch at the time of the sermon, and then get it in the oven, bake it, and we had it for communion. It was really hot that day. I mean, honestly, when I broke that bread, I burnt my fingers. But it's a super easy bread recipe, and it's really cool to impress your friends and your family because you can do it like an hour before dinner. It doesn't take 4 hours like some bread recipes. So that's the bread. Take it, do that, and bake it at, the recipe says 500. That's what the cookbook said. My way of doing it, I do 475. 500 works, it's fine, but it goes really fast. I usually do 475 for 10 to 13 minutes, and that tends to work really well, but watch it really closely. What I sometimes do with it, you can brush it with a little olive oil just before you bake it. You can sprinkle it with salt, like kosher salt. You can sprinkle it with herbs. You can do anything with it. It's fantastic. So if you've been baking with us, go ahead and make it and stick it in your oven, and it's gonna, or no, stick it aside to rise. And in about anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour, bake it for 10 to 13 minutes. It's fantastic. All right. Let me see where we are here.
The fun part.
Oh yeah.
It's the tasty part.
Yeah. I've been saying that, you know, we're talking about the Mediterranean triangle, which absolutely, you know, remember it's grain, olive oil, and wine. Thank you. Forgot that one. Grain, olive oil, and wine. We're going to take a break. We're going to talk about olive oil in a little bit. But right now, we're going to make dessert just because time-wise, we've got to get that in the oven. We're going to make cheesecake. Now, this doesn't look like the cheesecake we just looked at. But you know, they're actually not completely dissimilar. This cheesecake recipe actually comes from an actual first century BC Roman cookbook. Apicius was, I can't talk and do this at the same time. Apicius was an early Roman writer, and Apicius was probably not his name. Apicius basically means gourmet or a purveyor of fine cuisine, something like that. So to make this cheesecake, this actually comes and is very, very, very close to what his recipe was. You take 1 cup, oh, I should put the flour in. No, I'm going to put the cheese in first. 1 cup of ricotta cheese. And you just take it and make sure it's nice and soft, which mine is. You add to that 1 cup of flour. Beat up 1 egg. Oops, I'm nervous and I got a shell in there. Oh no. Believe me, it's a little nerve-wracking to have to cook in front of everybody. You take an egg and just beat it lightly and add that in. And then you just take that, mix it together until it's nice and smooth, and it forms kind of a dough. Oops. I'm using a wire whisk, but a spoon might work better. I forgot that. You just beat it up, and it forms kind of a dough with that ricotta cheese and everything like that. Then what you do is you take a baking sheet. Again, I lined it with parchment, and you take bay leaves. And this is really cool. I found fresh bay leaves at Wegmans. Who knew? But I just have 1 big bay leaf on, I don't know if you can see this here. Actually, I will stop the share so you can see what I'm doing. You just put a bay leaf, 4 bay leaves here, and then you just spoon on top of each bay leaf, you spoon some of the dough. And divide it into 4. Notice I didn't add any sugar to it. That's going to come later. What we're going to do is you put this on here. We're going to bake it for 35 to 40 minutes.
I did mine already.
Oh, lovely.
Fantastic.
Beautiful, Karen.
So you take them, bake 35 to 40 minutes, and they're very different. And then when they come out, we're going to put them in. We're just going to take about a quarter cup of honey and put it on the bottom of a bowl or a plate, and just when they're hot, you stick them in that honey, and it will absorb the honey, and that's where you're going to get the sweetness. It really, it's surprisingly delicious. Now, when I serve them, I put a little more honey on top. The other recipe I shared were the donuts. That also comes from an early, it was actually on a stone tablet that they found that recipe for the globi. And it's a very, very similar dough, almost identical. It just doesn't have the egg with it. And you just take that and fry it in hot oil like you would a donut, and they're absolutely delicious. So
what do you do with Joanne? Joanne, what do you do with the bay leaf after you bake it?
You put the bay leaf, you put the dough right over top of the bay leaf.
But after you bake it, after you bake it, does it stay with it, or when you put with the honey?
I usually take the bay leaf off because I figure by then the bay leaf has done its thing. So, but if you really are into eating bay leaves, I guess you could leave it on. I'm not. In fact, I had someone tell me that bay leaves might be poisonous. I'm not sure how true that is, but
No.
I don't think they are.
No.
But that gives you the idea of the globi and the cheesecake. So we're going to let that go for 35 minutes in the oven until it's nice and brown. Karen, yours looked beautiful. Mm-hmm. So have you tasted it? Oh, Karen's not there. Have you tasted it yet? Karen, have you tasted a little piece?
Not yet. I tasted the honey.
Okay.
I used the honey on it, so I haven't tasted it yet. We'll see how it turns out. Yeah,
they're different. If you're expecting the Cheesecake Factory cheesecake, it's not going to taste like that, but it's pretty good. Anyway.
Yeah. Yes, I imagine it is.
It almost looks like a cheese Danish.
Yeah, they really do. That might be a little closer to what it would be. What I find really fascinating about these, we wonder, when would Jesus have eaten cheesecake? Well, actually, when we read about all of these occasions for meals in the first century, they were absolutely, it was an event. And when you invited someone who was important over for dinner, you did everything possible. That's that whole idea of Middle Eastern hospitality, that kind of thing. And so this is from Luke 14, when Jesus was going to have dinner with one of the Pharisees. The thing about Jesus going to dinner, things always happened. He either was, in this case, it was on the Sabbath, and he ended up healing somebody on the Sabbath. And of course, the Pharisees got their panties all in a bunch over that. But the other thing was, Jesus would go to dinner and people would just show up off the street and happen to pour oil over his head or on his feet or wash his feet with their hair, all of those kinds of things. And Jesus was not the ideal dinner guest because he often would kind of offend people. In this chapter, chapter 14 of Luke, this is where he began to rail against his host and talk about how, you're providing a meal here, but what about providing a meal for the poor? What about caring for neighbors? What about caring for those who are in need? That kind of thing. I'm going to go on.
Go ahead, yeah.
Okay. Now on to making cheese. I'm going to wash my hands real quick. Whenever we hear about cheese and or about curds or milk in the Bible, anytime you read that, some historians think that what was actually being referred to was not milk like we would think of drinking a glass of milk, but instead it was cheese. Remember, there was no way to refrigerate things. So instead, they would make cheese. And this was the way to kind of preserve the cheese. The easiest way to do cheese, and I forgot to turn my milk on. Wait, that's the wrong one. All right. I forgot to turn my milk on. I'll show you that. We'll talk about it first. We might go to, I think I'll do the oil first, and then we'll talk about the cheese. This would have been one of those things, if I was really on the Food Network, we would have like taken this out and I would have gone back and done it right. I made some cheese yesterday from goat milk, which is really fun. You know, and it really came out, and it does taste like real honest to goodness goat's cheese. And I made some this afternoon from cow's milk, and we're going to make cow's milk cheese in just a second. The best way to make cheese is to heat your milk till it's just below boiling. The experts say 180 to 190 degrees if you have a thermometer, but just so it's hot but not boiling yet. And then the recipe I shared said 1 tablespoon of lemon juice or vinegar. I usually add a little bit more than that. But what you need to do is you need to sour your milk. In other words, you need to spoil it. Make it spoil. So what I did, this is the cheese I made today. I made it actually from 3 cups of milk, but then when I was putting it into the cheesecloth, I spilled it. So I'm not really sure how much 3 cups of milk would really equal, but I haven't opened this yet, so I'm just looking at it for the first time. What I've read is some places say let your cheese go and drip, and I'll show you how to put it into the cheesecloth and let it drip in a bit. Let it go for about 6 hours or overnight. I don't think you necessarily have to. I did that with the goat's cheese, but this is a very much creamier when you do it from just doing it. And this probably was hanging in the cheesecloth for maybe about 1.5 hours to 2 hours, something like that. My hands are a mess. Thank you.
Yeah, because it would have been.
I have so much respect for the Food Network.
Keep doing.
Even though I tried to prepare everything. The best way to do the cheese, and we'll get off this already while my milk is heating, is to take a strainer, and if you have like a high bowl, I found that my mixing bowl from my KitchenAid mixer works perfectly. I just lay your strainer in there, line it with some cheesecloth.
It's gonna be a while. Okay.
I'm sorry? Oh, okay. Line it with maybe 2 layers of cheesecloth.
Sorry.
And then all you're going to do is sour your milk. It's going to separate into the solids and then the liquid. The solid part is called the clabber, and that's what gives you that nice white. Here, I don't know if you can see. This is my goat. This one here is my cow's milk cheese that I just made this afternoon, and it's the consistency of maybe ricotta, or if you've bought goat's cheese, it's about like that. I have to remember what's what. And my goat cheese looks about the same. It's just a little bit drier. So, and it really tastes good. It's a good cheese. It's very bland, but it still is a really kind of fun thing to make. How's my?
It's come along.
Let me see how hot my milk is. Okay, a little bit more. We'll go to the next part and then we'll make our cheese. Oil was a really big thing in the, we'll come back to the cheese as that's heating up. Sorry about that. Olives were one of the absolute main commodities in the first century. Olives, when we think about olives, I don't know about you, but I think about the Mediterranean bar at Wegmans, where you can get ripe olives and green olives and olives stuffed with pimentos and all different kinds of olives. I don't like olives. Doug does, but I don't. But the olives in the first century were probably never eaten. They were grown for their oil. And the oil actually was used not only for cooking, it was considered to be medicinal. It was used as a skin thing. It was used, to cure skin diseases, but it was also used for lighting. Olive oil was used in lights because you can light it just like you can other oils. And it was also one of the main sacrifices. You could go to the temple and offer a sacrifice of olive oil. And usually, oftentimes, olive oil is kind of paired with wine, talking about the abundance. This is one of my favorite Psalms anyway, but it's the whole idea, you shall eat the fruit of the labor of your hands. You shall be happy and it shall go well with you. Your wife will be like a fruitful vine within your house. Your children like olive shoots around your table. Again, it's all about the blessing of God that is realized in abundance through food, through grain, through crops. Another one here where it talks about bring forth food for the earth, wine to gladden the human heart, oil to make the face shine, and bread to strengthen the human heart. Again, it's all about abundance. Pretty much in the first century, most families it was subsistence farming, most of them would have at least one olive tree in their backyard. Even today, you see olive groves all over the Holy Land. When we talk about the Garden of Gethsemane, it was probably an olive grove that Jesus went to pray the night that he was arrested. The way olives are still harvested is you see this woman taking a stick. She's actually beating the branches. And I don't know if you can see it, but there's like a tarp down beneath. They beat the branches when the olives are ripe and they fall out of the tree onto the tarp. That's how they harvest. And if you're interested in it, you can still go to Jerusalem. The Lutheran World Federation has they're basically headquartered on the Mount of Olives. And you can go there in October and help with the olive harvest. It's very cool, I understand. So, let me get out of there.
Your milk is good.
My milk is good, I'm told. So, what we're going to do, all right. The milk is hot. It has just a little bit of a scum on it. You know how when you heat milk, you can take either a tablespoon and measure out very carefully. I do this. I squirt. And I do it, and you begin to see that it begins to separate. Another recipe I saw said 2 cups of milk to about 1/3 of a cup of lemon juice. So it's not an exact science, but you let it really separate out. And it looks really disgusting. I mean, if your milk looks really gross, you've done it right. Oh, this got really good. Oops, I don't want to fall over the dog. The dog just showed up. I'm going to try to bring this over here. I don't know if you can see. Try to get that in there. I don't know if you can see clearly. It is completely separated. The solids are separated from the liquid. The solid's called the clabber. The milky part, the liquid part, is the whey. What nursery rhyme is it that talks about eating your
Curds and whey, Little Miss Muffet.
Yeah, Little Miss Muffet. So now you've got curds and whey. So once that's separated out really well, you can let it go for a little bit. I'm kind of rushing it a little bit. Now, when I did this morning or this afternoon, I spilled it all. So hopefully I won't. Just really carefully pour it into the cheesecloth, into the strainer. And you just let it drain for a bit. Once it's drained pretty well, like I said, I'm gonna rush it a little bit. You bring it together. This is how I spilled it this afternoon. And I'm gonna let you do this.
Okay.
You tie it up. And so you just kind of bring it together.
I would more enjoy probably being lab management than I would enjoy being the researcher in the lab.
Okay, you can go down a little further.
I'm a bit more of somebody who enjoys breadth rather than depth in my work. And so it's
Yeah.
Hi, Kitty.
Yeah, I'll hold it.
Okay. Well, you gotta hold it together.
I know. Yeah, hold it together, man. Hold on. Okay.
Eliminated their
You're
base.
supposed to let this drip a little bit longer before you try to do this.
You're supposed to have Teflon hands because it's hot.
Okay, now you can let go.
There we go.
Thank you.
Nice.
And I think when I looked at some of the, also with some of the research positions, I prefer someone to come to me with the problem, like, here's the
So
problem.
you just let that drip like this.
I don't really.
What I do then is I take just a wooden spoon, and I'm gonna make a mess here. Actually, I can use that bowl there. That was my messy bowl. So, and I just put my wooden spoon on the top and tie this to the wooden spoon and just let it drip away. And like I said, in about an hour to maybe an hour and a half, you have like a really nice soft cheese. And now it's bland. It's not going to be, it's like eating ricotta or eating cottage cheese, something like that. But you just, I don't know if you can see what I did. I just tied it to the wooden spoon and just have it over top of the bowl. This process has not changed since the 1st century. Let that go. The way they would preserve it then is with oil. And so you can just take plain old olive oil and pour it over top of it. And if you cover it entirely, the olive oil will keep it so that it will not spoil. What's really fun to do is to steep the olive oil. What I have here, I have olive oil that I've been steeping in it fresh thyme, a little bit of garlic, and some scallions, and that I chopped up. And all you do, and you can either cover it with it, just pour it over top, and let that cheese marinate a little bit with those flavors. Ooh, it smells really good.
Can you smell that?
So I don't know if you can see what I've done here. I'll come a little closer. And this is where you can get really creative. I just have it over top. And this is where you can get really, really creative. Use flavors that you like. Use herbs, spices. You can mix in honey and cinnamon. You can mix in cloves. Take pumpkin pie spice and everything like that. What I have in here is probably pretty authentic to the 1st century. Scallions or wild onions or chives or something like that. People would have foraged. And so they would have taken things like that. Thyme, things like, I'm drawing a complete blank right now. Oh, parsley, coriander, those kinds of things. Those are really common. What I'm going to do with the goat cheese, I don't know if this is going to work. I have never done this before. I actually have been steeping lavender blossoms in olive oil. Lavender goes really, really well with honey. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to take my goat cheese that I made yesterday. I'm just going to stick some honey in it. I don't know if you can see what I'm doing here. I'm just going to mix it up with the goat cheese, mix the honey in. I think we need more honey. And just mix the goat cheese in with the honey, and then I'm going to pour my lavender oil over top of it.
Joanne,
Yeah.
what do you usually do with that goat cheese then?
Well, you can use this for the fennel recipe we're going to do next, or when you do it like this with the cheeses, with the herbs, it is fantastic to put on bread. To use it as a dip for crackers, things like that. Use it as a dip for vegetables, like fresh vegetables. I have a recipe. It's not really totally authentic 1st century, but I have a recipe that uses goat cheese, mixes it together with a little bit of cream cheese, that's not 1st century, to make it a little bit, just hold it together a little creamier, and then add in some honey, chop up, believe it or not, a red onion, And then add cranberries, which are not first century, but if you want to be first century, you can add raisins. And maybe some chopped dried apricots, and put that all together, and then serve it with crackers or, the other thing it's really good with is ginger snaps. If you take ginger snaps and spread them on the ginger snaps, it's a really, really good little dip. So this is where you can be really creative. So I'm going to take my lavender. We'll see how this goes. I don't know. Well, I'm going to try to see, just let it marinate in that lavender. And you can eat lavender. It is edible. I put really a lot of lavender in there. We'll see what happens. Smells pretty good, so we'll let you know what happens with that one. But you can serve that then with the bread that we're going to make, which probably, if you made the bread earlier, this might be a good time to stick it in the oven. This would be a really good time. It probably has risen enough. So, how am I doing time-wise? Oh my goodness, we are in good shape. I wasn't expecting us to be this, organized. Yeah. Let's talk about fennel. Fennel is another one of those, I don't know, is it considered a root, or what is it considered? I'm not sure if it's considered a vegetable or what it is. I have to tell you, I do not like licorice. I do not like anise. I love fennel. It has a little bit of an anise taste to it, but it's not strong. And I absolutely love it. This I discovered just doing all this first century cooking stuff. This is a fennel bowl, and they smell amazing. They're just incredible. When you cut fennel, it makes the whole house smell. And I was cutting fennel this afternoon, and I was like, oh my gosh, it smells so good. So I've already sliced it, but the way you do it, you just cut the top off. Just cut your top off, cut the bottom where the root goes. I usually peel off the outer shell of it. And for this recipe, you just slice it maybe about 1/8 of an inch thick. And I have a whole bowl full that I've sliced up here. This is one of my favorite recipes that I have discovered with this. We have this a lot. And even when our kids were younger, they liked this, which is really saying something for kids. If you look at my spice mixture here, the garlic, the cumin, and the coriander would have been very, very, very authentic, first century. These are things that would have grown in the Holy Land, and people would have foraged for them. Paprika or chili powder, not so much, but it tastes really good with the paprika. So if you want to be authentic, don't put paprika or chili powder in it. But the other things work really well. And if there are other spices you like, go ahead and try it. It's really fun. Just take the fennel, add a little bit of salt. I've already measured out my spices here. Just dump that in. And just take some olive oil. And like I said, I don't necessarily measure because, it's kind of hard to tell what's what. So I just kind of put it in just so it's maybe coated. I use 2 fennel bulbs here. And then you just take it, mix that together so it's coated really, really, really well.
Joanne, could you stop sharing and see so we can see what you're doing?
Sure. Thank you. I forgot to do that. Yeah. So you just kind of mix in you mix in the oil with the spices and just toss it so everything is pretty much covered with the spices. You can also do it with your hands. That's how I usually do it, but I'm trying to be very delicate and dainty for you all today. So, but it looks just so it's kind of covered. I don't know if you can see. My spices are, this all mixed in with the olive, just tossed as much as you can. And this is such a difficult recipe. Once you've done that, I forgot the garlic. There's garlic here too. Sorry. I minced my garlic ahead of time. Mix the garlic in. Y'all are making me nervous.
You're not actually making her nervous. She's just nervous by nature. So just let's be clear on that.
Nah. Take it and just take a baking tray, spread it out in the baking tray, kind of in a single layer if you can, and you pop it in the oven. 400 is a good time. My cheesecake's in at 425. It's close enough. So pop it in for maybe 10 to 15 minutes until it's just a nice golden brown. And so I'm going to throw that in there. Well, Doug's going to throw it in there. And we'll talk, then when we get it out, I'll show you what to do with the goat cheese. But actually, if you like anise, which I don't, but my husband does, the really leafy, ferny tops of fennel, that's where you get the real anise taste. So if you really like it, you can take that, wash it good, and then chop up those little fronds. Oops, it's falling apart. And you can just kind of sprinkle this on top of the fennel. You can sprinkle it in all different kinds of things. And again, it's really, it's fairly authentic. We're going to put goat cheese on this. Now, I'm using just the purchased Wegmans goat cheese for this. But it's kind of interesting when we talk about the whole thing with cheese. If you're familiar at all with Jewish kosher laws and just the things about food, we know that you might be aware that Jews do not eat cheese and meat together. No cheeseburgers, no pepperoni pizzas. Well, you wouldn't eat pork either. But, that's one of the things that in Jewish culture, in the Jewish law, is not permitted. Let me go back to here. There are all kinds of things throughout Deuteronomy primarily that talk about food laws and what is allowed and what is not. This is one of those times in Matthew where Jesus was accosted by the Pharisees at this point. And we're told that the Pharisees came to Jesus and said, "Why don't your disciples wash their hands before they eat?" Now, this is one of those things that we might think, well, wouldn't they have washed their hands if they were dirty? That's not what they're talking about here. What they're talking about is the whole idea of the cleanliness laws. You see that throughout Deuteronomy, there are all these laws about staying ritually clean, which involved a really complex series of baths, of bathing. It was called a mikvah. And you would go to the mikvah, and with prayers, you would do this bath and everything. And the idea was to keep yourself ritually clean. The things that made you unclean were, for example, coming in contact and literally touching somebody who was not Jewish or someone else who was unclean. If I'm clean and Doug's not, and I touch him, I don't make him clean. He makes me unclean. Touching animals that, if you think about the disciples as fishermen, touching any animal that was unclean. I mentioned about fish, that tilapia were okay, but shellfish were not okay. They were considered an unclean animal, as were catfish, because catfish have skins and not scales. It's really complex in here. So touching anything like that, coming in contact with any kind of bodily fluid, something along those lines, would make someone unclean. So it wasn't just washing your hands for hygiene before you ate a meal. What they were talking about here was that ritual cleanliness. And the Pharisees, that was something that really held to, was that before they ate, you had to be clean. The other thing was you never shared a meal with somebody who was unclean. Now, people who were unclean would have been non-Jews. We hear about Samaritans in the gospel stories. We hear about, anybody who was a non-Jew, they were considered unclean. But so too were lepers, people who had any kind of, a physical ailment, those people who were sick, anything like that, though they were considered unclean. And so to maintain that ritual cleanliness, you never came in touch with any of those people. This is, one of the things that talks now about keeping kosher. If you've ever, learned about kosher laws, you're not ever supposed to eat anything that dies itself. You can't pick up carcasses off the side of the road, things like that. You don't eat dead fish or anything like that. But interestingly, it says in here, well, you can give it to aliens residing in your towns. In other words, you can give it to non-Jews or foreigners. They can eat it. You can even sell those things to a foreigner. So the disciples who were fishermen could have, if they got catfish in their nets or if they got some shellfish, they could sell them to foreigners. They just were not allowed to eat them themselves. There's been lots of speculation as to what made certain foods to be considered kosher. Whoops, let me get out of there. What made certain things kosher and what made things okay to eat. And nobody really knows. Part of it could have been just food safety, that perhaps, eating shellfish, the shellfish can spoil quicker and maybe make you sick. The same thing with eating pork. We hear about, different diseases you can get from eating pork if it's not prepared properly or cared for. It could have something to do with that. But some rabbis believe that it was totally because we want to set ourselves apart. We want to be different than those people around us. And what we eat, how we eat, who we eat with are ways that set us apart as being God's people versus those who are not. That whole thing about boiling a kid in its mother's milk. Hold on. Do you want to start the onions? Okay. Boiling a kid in its mother's milk. That's the only place in Scripture where it really talks about dairy and meat together. But the way this kind of came about was that, you had your Pharisees they were the lawyers. The Pharisees were the ones who were really working hard to try to figure out what is it how do we keep the law? How do we do this in the best way possible? And so they looked at that and said, okay, we shouldn't, take, a lamb and boil it in sheep's milk. Well, wait a minute. What if, and they started asking questions. Well, should we ever eat lamb in milk? Well, maybe just to be safe, we should never combine lamb and milk. And then is this limited just to lamb? Or what about other meats? What about chicken? What about beef? Can we put that with milk? And so you see how it kind of went like this? So the only law that's actually in the Bible is that one about don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. But what came out of this were writings like the Talmud and the Mishnah, which took these laws and interpreted them. And the laws in the Bible, all of a sudden expanded into so many more laws. And so it is that one little verse about the boiling a kid in the milk that really expands. If you have ever known an Orthodox Jewish family who keeps a kosher kitchen, where you have two separate sets of plates and two separate cabinets and two separate sinks, because you never, ever, ever let even the dishes that you eat dairy off of touch the dishes that you eat meat off of, because this is all this interpretation of the law. And so to us, it seems a little crazy, but we have to understand where this is coming from. These are people who, they look at history and they say, we went into exile. We were sent to Babylon when Jerusalem was destroyed. If we had kept the law better, is it possible that maybe we wouldn't have been destroyed? And so it's this whole idea But this is where Jesus gets at it when he's asked, what is the greatest commandment? And he answers, well, you're to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And then he goes on and says, but there's another one that's just as important, and that is to love your neighbor as yourself. So much of what Jesus was teaching about, even with kosher laws, was if keeping the law gets in the way of serving your neighbor, of caring for your neighbor, of feeding your neighbor, then your neighbor is actually more important than the law. The law was not meant to, that somehow we are supposed to just adhere to the law, period. The law was given to us to show us ways that we can love God and love our neighbor. So that's kind of a little bit where, a very, very, very short version of where maybe Jesus was coming from, and more of a New Testament, more of a, a different interpretation as we see the law, as we see covenant and some of those kosher laws from Deuteronomy and Leviticus. Doug is sauteing onions because it is time to make our chickpeas. Thank you. Let me. Spices, in the first century, we might think that people then were just kind of simple and all that kind of thing. But that wasn't necessarily the case. They liked spiced foods just like we do. And so seasoning was really important. This is a spice market from the old city in Jerusalem. And from what I've read, they haven't really changed a lot in 2,000 years. You go in there and you choose whatever it is you want. Oh, something's dinging. Oh, I think our cheesecake's done. So what you do is you go in there and you pick your spices, you pick spice mixtures and all of those kinds of things. And that probably didn't change since the first century. We're going to make this chickpea dish, which is really kind of interesting. Spices, I mentioned about the, having the garlic, even like what we think of as Queen Anne's lace is actually wild carrots, chives, parsleys, things like that. Those things would have been common to even peasants. Now, when we talk about spices, we're talking a little more the upper class. These would have been used by people who had a little more, they were a little wealthier, because these are spices that would have come from the East. And there was a really active spice trade even during Jesus' time. And so what we're doing here, Doug is sauteing some onions. And, you just take the onions and saute them till they're soft. Are they soft?
They are soft.
He did an amazing job over there. He's a really good cook. Don't let him tell you that he's not. And what I've done is I've already mixed together my 1 teaspoon of cardamom, the allspice, the cumin, cinnamon, and cloves. These would have all been known in the first century. These would have been, traded from the Far East and on the spice road, if you've heard about that. They're really pretty together. They're all different. I'll show you. They're all different shades. I don't know if you can see in I know I have my share screen. But you just mix these together. Saute your onions in some olive oil. Saute your onions in your olive oil. Mix together these spices. And if there are other spices that you like better, that's perfectly okay. Spice mixtures are totally, something that is personal preference. And even in the first century, it was like that. Even now in Jerusalem, when you go to these spice shops, each purveyor of spices have their own signature blends that are very secret and handed down for generations. So once once your onions are nice and soft, can you see me over there? I'll stand here. Once the onions are nice and soft and sauteed, you just take your spices and stir them in. Dump them in. Mix it together just for a few seconds, just so it's nice and blended.
Take this over.
Yeah, we can. What can I put it on? Ah! I need it. I've got one. Sorry, we have technical difficulties here. Okay.
Is that the center?
Yep, that's good. So I don't know. Thank you. I don't know if you can see, it smells amazing. I don't think there are too many more wonderful smells than sauteed onions. And then when you add all the spices to it, it's pretty incredible. You take that. I have my chickpeas here. All I did was take 2 cans of good old Wegmans chickpeas. They're 59 cents a can. I mean, this is incredible. You take them, drain them and rinse them. You can use dried garbanzo beans or dried chickpeas, but this is so much easier. Take your chickpeas, dump it in. I would normally do this over the stove. Mix it in and let the onions and the spice just cover the chickpeas. You may need to add a little bit more oil. I think we're good here.
We have fennel too.
No fennel. No, the fennel's done too.
Done,
I see
yeah.
what you're saying.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought you wanted to add fennel to this. But I don't, can you see what I've,
Yes.
once that's all mixed together, you can do all sorts of things with this. The other night we served this over rice, and it is just, it's really good over rice. You can add a little bit of vegetable broth to it if you want it a little bit moister, or a little more olive oil, something like that. You can add different, you can stir in some spinach if you'd like, if you want, or kale or some kind of a green, stir that in with it and serve it over rice. What we're going to do today, if I can find it, where'd it go? I've lost my pan. Oh, there it is. I've already diced up some cucumbers and tomatoes. And normally I would let this cool a little bit more. But if you take some of the chickpeas, this is a heavy pan, stir it in with the cucumbers and the tomatoes. Let's put some in there. And it makes a little bit more of a salad. Like I said, I would let it cool a little bit more before I would do that normally. But mix it in with that. You can also mix it in with other vegetables. Like if you want to mix it in with like green beans or something like that, it's fantastic. And then what I've made here, you can eat it just like that, or I made a dressing of, and this is where you can get really creative. You can just use a vinaigrette dressing that you buy at Wegmans or buy at Hagedorn's or wherever you, or something you've made from scratch, any kind of vinaigrette. What I've made up here is I mixed, I had some lime oil. I feel like I'm doing a commercial, but if you haven't been to F. Oliver's, they have probably 200 different kinds of flavored olive oils and balsamic vinegars. And I'm embarrassed to say how many we have in our cabinet, but you can mix all these different things together. So what I have here is a lime olive oil and just a little bit of balsamic, and I put a little bit of garlic in here. And I'm just going to, like a dressing, just add that and stir it up. And it gives you an amazing side dish, or if you're doing a vegan thing, it gives you, it makes for a really, really great main dish. In the first century, like I said, meats would have actually not been consumed all that much. You would have probably had a lot of vegetables. And especially in Galilee, much of the protein would have come from beans, from chickpeas, from what they call pulses. So it's really pretty too. So I don't know if you can see, I'll come over here so you can see a little closer. And it makes for, you can eat it hot or as a cold salad, and it really is delicious. Or eat it over rice. There's so much you can do with it. The chickpeas are also really good by themselves. And after I put this together, I found a recipe for roasted chickpeas that you actually just roast in the oven. And the recipe said they get crispy, and you can let them cool, and it's like eating popcorn. And that they're really good. I haven't tried it, but it sounded pretty amazing. Real quick, the fennel. Let me put that on the plate. So just to give you kind of an idea of what all we've made and what it all looks like. Oh, wait, I forgot to finish the fennel.
Yeah.
What you're supposed to do with the fennel, again, this would be one of those outtakes for the Food Network. You take your goat cheese. There it is. Dab the goat cheese around on top of the fennel. Just toss it on top here and there. Probably should be using a knife with this, but you get the idea. You put the goat cheese all over the fennel, stick it back in the oven for about 2 or 3 minutes until it just melts just a little bit, and then stir it all together. And it's absolutely fantastic. This is still hot enough that I think we'll get the idea of it. It's hot enough that it's melting it, but it's even better in the oven. Just toss it, bring it together, and the taste of that goat cheese, if you're familiar with goat cheese, it has that kind of sharp, more little pungent taste to it. I'm gonna hold that and I'll put it on the
Sure.
Like I said, this is one of I think it's one of our favorite side dishes. The roast fennel with goat cheese. It just, if you toss it, it's absolutely delicious. So we've got our chickpeas. I've got a messy counter here. We've got our fennel. I confess I cheated and I made bread earlier because I wasn't sure how I was going to get it all together and make it. We've got our bread.
And don't forget this.
Oh, it's coming. We've got our cheese, our goat cheese and our cow cheese that's marinated. And then the best part. You take your, this is a whole counter and I'm still running out of room. You take your honey, just smush it all around the dish. And take your little cheesecakes, sit it in that honey. My bay leaves came up with it, but if I was being a little more careful, I'd peel the bay leaf off. And there's a little more honey on top.
And we have dessert.
Yum.
So that's, I lost my mouse, there it is. So that's kind of our Middle Eastern meal.
Wow.
This is pretty authentic. So.
Bravo. Bravo. Thank you so much.
I have a great deal of respect for Food Network people. And I'm 6 minutes over. Good. I didn't mess up too badly. So, do you have any questions or anything that you'd?
No, but I'm hungry.
It smells
So what
pretty
time
good
can
here.
you come over? You
You're
know?
right.
Once COVID's over, we need to do this in person so we can share it all together and then we can eat together.
That'd be
I have a
great.
I have a question about the cheesecake.
Yes,
The recipe says to cover it before you put it in the oven. Did you do that?
I didn't. You can. I've done it both ways. I didn't today just because I kind of forgot. It actually comes out fine. I usually just put aluminum foil over top of it. It comes out a little softer. With this, when you have it this way, and it's really good to eat warm too, it's a little crunchier on the outside, so it's a little more the consistency of a donut. And if you take it, I'll bring it over here.
I forgot to put a tent over mine too, so I'll see how
Well,
it turns
I
out.
did use the
Oh, you
tent.
can
Mine
see.
isn't as dark, so.
Yeah, well, that
Yeah.
probably isn't, yeah.
It's really good.
No fair.
Now that I have honey all over my hands.
So you know what we're having for dinner tonight.
And our son just got home too.
Just in
So,
time.
All right.
Joanne,
That was great. Thank you very much. Both of you.
Joanne.
it was a lot of
Learned
fun.
a lot.
So blessings to you all, and I look forward to when we can cook in person. That's when it's going to be really fun.
Carol has a question.
I
Okay.
have one question.
Oh, you had a question?
I was wondering about the bread. Have you ever made it more like a loaf as opposed to, would it just bake longer?
I've never made this recipe in a loaf. It's really similar to like some Italian and French bread recipes that I have made. This one is, this is more the way it would have been in Middle Eastern time or in first century time. The way bread would have baked, they would have either had a honey, kind of like a honey bee, or like a hive, not honey bee, a beehive kind of oven that they would have taken, and they would have built a wooden fire in it and smushed it on the walls of the oven. Much like making naan. It's more of a pita bread.
Okay.
And so it's more of a flatbread kind of idea. I've never done it in a loaf. This is the way I've kind of tended to make it usually. The other way that it would have been done, the whole idea of the sage, idea of making that flatbread, probably your peasants would have made it by doing it over an open fire, putting rocks in the fire, heating the rocks, then pulling the rocks out, and then baking the bread on top of the rocks. Something like that if you didn't have an oven. So this is more of that flatbread idea. If you think pita bread, like
Yes.
when you think of Middle Eastern pita bread.
Okay. Great. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Let us
Thank
know
you.
how things come
Thank
out.
you.
Yeah, if you cook, send me pictures.
Yeah. And if it doesn't work out, don't tell us.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.